Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of BET. I'm Janine de Villiers. I'm the Higher Education Business Manager at Lenovo. Joining me today is Sam. Sam, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So, my name's Samantha O'Leary. I am the Head of Training at TA Education, or Tablet Academy as we're also known. And I provide training around the use of technology. Used to be an English teacher, so really happy to be with you here today.
Okay. And how has the past 2 days been at BET?
Really good, lots of really interesting conversations, a lot of conversations around AI, so I'm really pleased to be having this conversation with you today, because I think it's really important at the moment.
Well, I was going to ask you that question, but thank you. So today's topic, I think, is quite an interesting one. So I think everybody's talking about AI.
Yes.
And I think what is not missing, but the questions that I've been asked by educators not the question I've been asked, or I've had a couple of conversations with educators, and the common theme is you guys are just pushing AI all the time. But how are we? I don't want to lose that human connection with my students. So that is our topic for today, is how we maintain the human connection with the use of AI.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that leads us to our first question. So what do you believe is the most common misconceptions of the use of AI in teaching?
I think one of the key ones is that AI is going to replace me as a teacher. So often I find teachers are terrified about the implications of AI. I was talking earlier on today about the impact AI has on education technology across the education field, and I think it's as big as the introduction of the cloud, and then prior to that the introduction of the internet. And I think we're always fearful of what we don't know. And we're always worried about the implications of that. And so one of the key things I think is understanding actually that AI is not, in an education context, is not about replacing teachers at all, but it's about teachers understanding how to harness AI, I think is the biggest challenge.
Okay. So how do we ensure the use of AI in teaching to enhance the teaching experience and not hinder it? Because it's every day. Today I had the same discussion with an educator, and I asked, well, how are you implementing AI within the classroom? And it's a little bit, I'm too scared. So how do we actually enhance the use of AI in teaching and not hinder it?
I think it's about teachers understanding the potential. I did a talk today earlier on around prompt engineering and effective prompt engineering. And I think one of the biggest things that is fearful is actually the tools to use themselves. So for instance, if I'm using Copilot, am I safe? And understanding that you have enterprise grade protection with the use of Copilot and so on, means that actually we can use it within an education environment. But a lot of teachers, I think, lack that knowledge, and so training is actually really key. And I'm not just saying that because that's what I do. Actually, the educator in me, going back to the classroom, what I know that the team that I used to lead would need is actually decent training around the potential of what we can do in the classroom, and then constant, consistent, open discussions about how we use that across the school. So it's not, I think often we worry about kind of individual teachers, but this is a whole school policy conversation. It's a whole school kind of approach. And I'm not talking about kind of the teacher will tell you the boring stuff, but actually thinking about how are we working collaboratively together to maximise the use of AI. So.
And you talk about teaching or training the teachers. What type of training? So if you had to go to an institute and say, we want to start training you on the use of AI, what would be the very first topic, or what would the first thing you train them on be?
I think prompt engineering is actually one of the key things certainly to look at. I did some training last month where we actually looked at training the whole staff. So I ended up kind of with doing a keynote with 200 staff in the room around kind of AI, and then we split into groups to actually kind of put things into practice. And for them, it was understanding actually not just how to use different prompts, but the kinds of opportunities that a tool like Copilot, for instance, could offer us in terms of, actually thinking about whether we're using it for retrieval practice, whether we're using it for assessment, are we using it for lesson planning, are we using it for image generation, all of those things, how it fits into curriculum planning for teachers, and then how they can save time. I think for teachers there needs to be an understanding actually of how we shorten their workload. It's the biggest problem we have in education.
So yes, it shortens the time in lesson plans, but one of the comments that I've heard is, I don't want to lose touch with my learner. So for example, you have a learner that has to write an essay. The educated, they don't want to use AI to help them with the correction or the marking, because they want to be able to read the work and connect with that learner. So how do we bridge this gap between I'm letting AI correct and mark versus I'm going to spend an hour reading this essay? So how do we bridge the gap?
I think there are interesting conversations around marking anyway, particularly with the recently published DFE paper around kind of the use of AI in education. I think the key thing for keeping the human connection in the classroom is understanding that the AI, in terms of the work that a teacher is doing, is always kind of bookended by the teacher. So we start with the teacher. AI can help support kind of shortening things down, but we also end with the teacher. The teacher is in charge of quality assurance. The teacher is in charge of what any output that goes out to students, whether that be worksheets, resources, any kind of sort of support materials for learning, or whether we're looking at marking and looking at trends. I've just done a whole piece of work where we looked at tracking trends and being able to kind of put a piece of work into AI and be able to say, give me the key kind of things that you notice around a particular kind of area. It's not to suggest that the teacher wouldn't read the work. The teacher is not stopping teaching. And that's the key thing. I think, we need to make sure we keep as a focal point, because actually, AI is an assistive tool to help us in the job of learning and learning and teaching. And actually, effectively the work I do with my students is likely to be enhanced by the use of AI, because I've got more time to actually spend with the students and actually work, on their work, if I'm not spending time kind of, sort of on procedural tasks that AI can support me with. So.
And do you see any major differences between the adoption of AI in K-12 and higher education?
It's a completely different conversation at the moment, I think, because within K-12 it's certainly about the teachers, and only the teachers really, although there is a brewing conversation about students, until we have a compliant approach for student use, across the big platforms, and that's consistent and embedded. The conversation for students is more difficult. So I think the focal point at the moment, certainly with the work I'm doing with schools, is very much kind of on making sure that teachers are supported in being confident, capable and comfortable with using AI, well. Whereas within HE, actually the conversation, because we're talking about kind of adults across the board, the conversation is very different. So it's actually thinking about how can educators, lecturers, teachers in HE use it, but it's also then thinking about the impact for students, and looking at making sure that students know how to get the most out of AI. It's not about plagiarism. It's not, let's be honest, that's not a new conversation. A lot of people treat the conversation around AI as though it's like, sort of this big thing. Students, if they were going to copy essays, plagiarism's been a thing for a long time. We've had the internet for a long time. Effectively, it's just another factor of that conversation. It does complicate things, don't get me wrong, but it is, sort of, it's not really a new conversation. Whereas what is new is actually how can we empower the learners to practically use AI to be able to, sort of move things forward in their learning.
And then, can you give us a few examples of how AI can foster a stronger connection between students and educators?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's think about differentiation for starters. So, and that works both from a connection point of view and from a teacher workload point of view. I'm thinking about students who actually might not be engaged in a classroom situation if we're not differentiating in a way that suits that learner. And if I can actually approach my lesson planning using AI to be able to differentiate for very specific kind of learning needs, I can actually produce resources and support materials that can actually support every single learner in my classroom. Now, that's what we've been trying to do for since day dot. But effectively, it's a way for me as a learner to have that as me as a teacher to have that as a manageable approach for learners, in a way that then allows the students to really engage in the lesson that we've got. And other options, I'm an English teacher by nature, and so the ability to be able to take a fictional place, in a book or a text, and be able to say, right, create me an image based on that type of description. I couldn't do that in a different way. Being able to give students a way to visualise something within a book. Sometimes, take Shakespeare for example. Dickens. All of these things are texts that predate even photography anyway. But actually, I can open up doors to learning for my students in ways that I probably couldn't do before. And I think it's just then looking at how we harness that and get students engaged when appropriate in being able to use it appropriately for expanding their learning.
So you were an educator.
Mm-hmm.
If AI was around in your time, do you think you would still be an educator?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, because I always talk about the fact that I left teaching partly because of workload. So it's a really, really interesting question. I think possibly yes, actually. So I think certainly I would have been one of the first people to jump into it and sort of explore it. I was always still am very, very nerdy in sort of looking at the ways that we can really embrace technology for teaching and learning. But yeah, it's a really interesting question, because actually I think possibly the answer would be yes.
So AI is part of everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see it in everyday life? So it's this misconception of I don't want to use AI, but it is in everyday life. So just give us a few examples.
I think you raise a really interesting point about the everyday life. I think, sort of everybody's using AI in different ways, whether it be through voice activated, sort of response systems. I won't say, hey, whoever, because it might fire off everybody's phones. But sort of the ability to be able to easily access information, and AI has been running through different things. So let's take forms as an example. For instance, sort of teachers have been using forms for a long time. Actually, that's had AI built into different things like question generation, being able to look at answers and that kind of thing, like auto-generated answers, even just simple things like I start typing an email and it starts sort of giving me predictive text. It's right down from really simple levels right the way through really key parts of our everyday life. I think it's just that we don't necessarily recognise it as AI, and I think understanding what AI is, what machine learning is, what is a large language model. We were talking yesterday about the difference between a large language model and a small language model. For most people, actually being empowered with that understanding, even at a really kind of sort of superficial level, I think actually is really important, because sort of perhaps it will reduce some of the fear. And actually make us understand that human connection isn't lost just because we're using technology in an assistive way.
So if you had to break it down in a really basic manner to an educator, what is AI to them?
Okay, so AI to them is an assistive tool to be able to use if we're thinking about generative AI, so if we focus on generative AI, an assistive tool to be able to use for lesson planning, to be able to use for resource creation, assessment, all of those things that are part of our day-to-day outside of the classroom, but then could actually be brought inside the classroom.
Yeah.
So, I used an example earlier on of, we were talking about image generation. What about if a student creates a character and I take that student's description and put that into the AI language model to then be able to bring that character to life. So I can use it inside the classroom, but actually I think at the moment there is a lot of conversation around it being an assistive tool to help me with planning, preparation. There are obviously many ways we could use it, but that's certainly kind of, I think, the best way to help unlock AI for educators.
Yeah.
So.
And some closing statements or remarks on tips for educators, how to adopt it, where to start,
okay, so
how not to be afraid.
How not to be afraid. Okay, so definitely engage in some learning around, an effective prompt approach. So thinking about understanding the different types of prompts there are, how to structure a prompt will help you to then, sort of bring things out and talk to your colleagues. I mean, sort of the key things, other people are using this and other people are using it in really innovative ways, but actually once you've got a good understanding or, at least a reasonable understanding, then you'll perhaps be able to see kind of the wider prospect. There's lots of resources out there. Don't be scared. I think, sort of in the end, it's not going away. So, really what we need to do is, sort of empower ourselves to be able to make the most out of it.
I saw quite a powerful story around the use of AI in the classroom. And, we are in the business of accessible AI and,
oh, yes, absolutely.
and equity, equal education for every learner. And I saw this really beautiful article where a teacher was using AI in the classroom to show the students their future self. And I'm not sure if you've seen that. And what they did was they asked every learner, what is it that you want to be one day? And, with the use of AI, they could create their future self. And I thought it was the most beautiful use of AI. So, from our side, I think we need to embrace it. It's not going away.
No. No. I go back to what I was saying sort of earlier, sort of it's as powerful a conversation as the introduction of the internet, the introduction of cloud computing, and, sort of that movement of, how we use technology in education has been rapid. I started working in education 25 years ago with a chalkboard. Yeah. The acceleration of the use of technology, particularly in the last 5 years or so, has been absolutely massive. And I think certainly, for educators, you can't be an ostrich. You can't stick your head in the sand. It isn't going away. But actually what we can do is help people to understand and embrace how it actually can be used for the greater good, as it were. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you, Sam. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Janine.
And enjoy the rest of BET. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Cheers.